Hello, my name is Dr. Terri Janke. I'm a Wurruthi Yardakana and Meriam woman. I'd like to begin by acknowledging country. Today I'm on Bidjigal country in Sydney, Australia, and I'd like to recognise and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I am today, where I work, live and create. I pay my respects to elders, past and present, and I celebrate the continuing connection that they have to this land and the practice of culture, sharing stories and knowledge in respectful ways. And I'm delighted to speak to you today about our exciting project that we are working with Wikimedia Australia, and that is to develop an Indigenous cultural and intellectual property and Indigenous data sovereignty guide for Wikimedia Australia staff. Our firm has worked over the past 25 years to protect Indigenous cultural and intellectual property, also called ICIP for short. And we are also working in the growing field of Indigenous data sovereignty. I'm very pleased to be invited to work alongside Wikimedia Australia to help facilitate and provide guidance around ethical use, management and control of ICIP and Indigenous data by the Wikimedia community. Indigenous knowledge on wiki platforms. Let's begin with Indigenous knowledge on wiki platforms. Between 2023 and 2024, Wikimedia Australia commissioned research into the protection of cultural knowledge and the cultural safety and experiences of Indigenous people on Wikimedia platforms, specifically Wikipedia, WikiCommons and Wikidata. 2 reports were created: First Nations metadata, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Libraries and Information Resources Network, or ATSI-Learn, Protocols for Description and Access by Kirsten Thorpe, Nathan Sentence and Lauren Booker, and a 2023 discussion paper by Professor Bronwyn Carlson and Lotus Rana titled "I Really Like Wikipedia, but I Don't Trust It: Understanding First Nations People's Experiences Using Wikipedia as Readers and/or Editors." I think the second title captures the challenge perfectly. Many Indigenous people see potentials in platforms like Wikipedia, but also may experience harm and misrepresentation. One quote from that work captures the dual potential of these platforms. Wikipedia has the potential to disrupt colonial modes of production, and it also has the potential to perpetuate them. This sums up the challenges that we face. That is ensuring that Wikimedia platforms become places of ethical participation and truth-telling, not digital spaces that reproduce harm and false information. So let me give you a summary of the key recommendations. 1, to develop guidelines to assist Wikimedia editors. 2, encourage First Nations peoples to become Wikipedia editors. 3, establish a First Nations advisory board. 4, re-evaluate open access editing of First Nations content. 5, address racist and culturally offensive and incorrect content. 6, consider how Indigenous research principles and tools, for example, traditional knowledge labels, might be utilised to support Indigenous cultural and intellectual property, ICIP rights through metadata. So why is best practice important for wiki platforms? Firstly, to shift the lack of trust between Indigenous people and Wikimedia platforms. To ensure open access editing practices that don't cause misinformation or harm to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. Because an understanding of Indigenous cultural and intellectual property is crucial for contributors who wish to ethically work with and protect Indigenous knowledges. And finally, to empower both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples to ethically contribute to and edit Indigenous content. This is the change we are striving for: a collaborative and culturally safe digital knowledge space that ensures the foundation can live up to its vision statement to imagine a world which every single human being can freely share in the sum of all knowledge. In order to do this, we need to ensure platforms are culturally safe for all users and reflect accurate, reliable information. Pictured here is my book, True Tracks, which outlines the 10 True Tracks principles that are used in our work at Terri Janke and Company to ensure best practice for working with Indigenous cultural and intellectual property and Indigenous data sovereignty. These principles form the foundation of our work with Wikimedia Australia and our development of the Indigenous cultural and intellectual property and Indigenous data sovereignty guide. TJC and Wikimedia Australian collaboration. Terri Janke and Company's work with Wikimedia Australia will be undertaken in several phases. In our previous phase, we completed a scoping report and preliminary assessment that included research and training on Wikipedia, WikiCommons and Wikidata, and a review of previous Wikimedia commissioned research. In our current phase, we're moving into developing a white paper on the broader topic of the issues and questions surrounding Indigenous cultural and intellectual property and Indigenous data sovereignty on wiki platforms, and it will outline some of the potential longer-term solutions to address the challenges that arise. And to support our work, we've called together an Indigenous expert working group to ensure that we're informed by a range of Indigenous perspectives and communities. And that group come from all over Australia. They work in libraries, media and knowledge management. And we're really looking forward to hearing their perspectives on how to introduce cultural safety in the wiki platforms. We'll also be attending Wikimedia conferences and road testing our Indigenous cultural and intellectual property and Indigenous data sovereignty guide with a key group of Wikimedians. The process is deeply collaborative. We will be consulting extensively with the Indigenous expert working group to ensure that the guide protects Indigenous cultural and intellectual property and Indigenous data sovereignty. And we also would like to make sure that the guide is practical for use by Wikimedia staff. Our work is guided at an international level by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples recognises the rights of Indigenous peoples worldwide to maintain, control, protect and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions. The Declaration informs how Indigenous cultural and intellectual property should be understood in the Wikimedia environment, not as open data to be extracted, but as living cultural knowledge requiring care, consent and context for use. So what does Indigenous cultural and intellectual property include? Indigenous cultural and intellectual property, or ICIP, includes all those things Indigenous people need to assert their rights as Indigenous people. It is their rights to their cultural heritage, and it includes art, languages, stories from country, images, knowledge and performances, those sort of things that Indigenous people need to practice and keep culture alive. So these rights are about recognising Indigenous peoples as the custodians and authors of their knowledge systems that have lasted many, many generations, and that we, as Indigenous people, have the responsibility to nurture and guard and pass on to the next generation. So it's about culture, it's about responsibility, and it's about cultural strengthening. Challenges for ICIP on Wikimedia platforms. However, there are some major challenges to Indigenous cultural and intellectual property protection in these spaces. Citation requirements favour non-Indigenous sources that may be outdated and incorrect. Any engagement, uploading, editing or referencing of content that has Indigenous knowledge in it on the Wikimedia platform must align with ethical and legal principles that protect Indigenous cultural and intellectual property rights. And that is why we're creating this guide. It's to ensure that every Wikimedia contributor is able to feel empowered to do this. There is often inappropriate and extractive use of Indigenous languages, names and cultural material in uploads. There's a lack of protection or resolution processes for harmful and culturally unsafe information. Content can include harmful representations and deficit-based framing. There is an absence of Indigenous perspectives within the Wikimedia community itself. All of these challenges highlight why Indigenous participation and culturally informed governance are essential. And of course, they also stress why we need the guides themselves. Next, let's turn to Indigenous data and Indigenous data sovereignty. Indigenous data includes data, facts or statistics about Indigenous people, from Indigenous people, and about Indigenous people's country and culture. Indigenous data sovereignty is the rights of Indigenous people to control data that's collected about them, their culture or their country. Indigenous data sovereignty is part of a global movement. Within this global movement, there are initiatives such as the Global Indigenous Data Alliance's CARE principles. These principles stand for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. They were created to fill the gaps in the FAIR principles: findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. CARE principles are created specifically for the protection and sovereignty of Indigenous data. The OCAP principles from Canada: ownership, control, access and possession. Australia's Mayam Ngari Wingara Indigenous Data Sovereignty Collective advocates for community-led governance of Indigenous data. Together, these initiatives are reshaping how information about Indigenous peoples is managed, putting Indigenous authority and governance at the centre. How to ethically manage ICIP and ID, Australian industry protocols. In Australia, we have many well-established industry protocols, some of which Terri Janke and Company has drafted and are based on our True Tracks principles. These industry protocols guide ethical management of Indigenous cultural and intellectual property and Indigenous data. These include the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies Code of Ethics, outlining ethical research practices when working with Indigenous peoples and knowledge. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Data Archive Protocols for data archiving of Indigenous data. Creative Australia, protocols for using First Nations cultural and intellectual property in the arts. The Lowitja Institute, taking control of our data. A discussion paper on Indigenous data sovereignty in Australia and practical steps for implementation. The National Indigenous Australians Agency, framework for governance of Indigenous data, outlining best practice for Indigenous data governance. Protocols are leading industry practice for successful Indigenous engagement. Protocols are emerging and growing in importance in health, research, arts, development and business sectors. Protocols are effective and respectful frameworks for using Indigenous cultural and intellectual property and for engaging with Indigenous peoples and their communities. Protocols go beyond the law to respect Indigenous peoples' rights and cultural differences. And protocols also encourage ethical conduct and promote interaction based on good faith and mutual respect. Walking together. So where are we going? This roadmap captures the spirit of walking together, step by step, building respect, collaboration and accountability into open knowledge spaces. Building upon the Commission studies done by Macquarie University and the Jumbunna Institute of the University of Technology in Sydney. Last year, we began a scoping project that involved in-house training, a preliminary assessment, and the creation of a roadmap to identify where Wikimedia's practices intersect with Indigenous cultural and intellectual property. We are now in the process of appointing an Indigenous expert working group comprised of expertise and representation across a range of sectors and across Australia to oversee the development of the guides and ensure that the outcomes reflect Indigenous authority and perspectives. Following that, we will carry out extensive consultation and collaboration, working closely with the Indigenous Expert Working Group and road testing this guide with key Wikimedians to refine any ethical and practical approaches. In April 2026, we will release a white paper at WikiConn Australia, and that will set out key issues for Wikimedia Australia regarding online cultural safety and protecting and managing Indigenous cultural and intellectual property and Indigenous data. The paper will be aimed at raising awareness regarding the project and engaging the community around these discussions, with a view to potentially carrying out a larger future national consultation. And finally, in July 2026, we are hoping to launch the Indigenous Cultural and Intellectual Property and ID Sovereignty Guide at Wikimania, Paris. We are working together with Wikimedia Australia to create a guide that sets an example of better practices online for handling Indigenous content. Looking ahead, our next step focus on the True Tracks principles. These principles are the foundation of Terri Janke and Company's work. They're 10 principles that guide respectful engagement with Indigenous cultural and intellectual property. They cover aspects like respect, self-determination, consultation and consent, interpretation, integrity, and benefit sharing. Applying these principles to Wikimedia means ensuring that the understanding is there for Indigenous voices to lead the process, and that consent is meaningful, and that the benefits of Indigenous knowledge is shared by the communities where they come from. So applying the True Tracks principles to Wikimedia means ensuring that Indigenous voices lead the process. It also provides that consent is meaningful and that the benefits of knowledge sharing are returned to Indigenous communities. So to close, the goal is simple but powerful: to create Wikimedia platforms where Indigenous knowledge is represented ethically, collaboratively, and with integrity. By embedding Indigenous cultural and intellectual property, Indigenous data, and the True Tracks principles, we can build a digital space that genuinely celebrates and protects Indigenous knowledge systems. Thank you for listening, and if you'd like to connect or learn more, please contact me at terri@terrijanke.com.au or visit our website terrijanke.com.au or connect with me on LinkedIn. Thank you very much.